For Super Bowl 25, the Buffalo Bills were favored to win against the New York Giants team playing with a backup quarterback. However, Giants head coach Bill Parcells perhaps did his best coaching job leading the Giants to their second Super Bowl. Unfortunately for Giants fans, Parcells would not return for the 1991 season, as the Giants would have an interesting period leading up to their next Super Bowl appearance. So Parcells said goodbye to the Giants in May of 1991. The 1990 Giants had a couple of coaches on the staff who wound up winning multiple Super Bowls in Bill Belichick and Tom Coughlin. However, Belichick was already hired to be the head coach at Cleveland, and Coughlin was already hired to be the head coach at Boston College. Furthermore, supposedly Giants GM George Young was not a fan of Belichick and didn't like how Belichick carried himself and didn't think he could handle the responsibilities of being a head coach. Nonetheless, the New York Giants' new head coach would be Ray Handley, who was the running backs coach with Parcells. Interestingly, Handley was a card counter at blackjack tables who once was banned from a casino in Reno, according to a New York Times article. With that said, Handley was also instrumental in helping Parcells with time management and when to use timeouts. So Ray Handley and the 1991 New York Giants had an interesting situation at quarterback. There was 35-year-old Phil Simms, the main QB for the Giants all throughout the 80s, had a tremendous performance leading the Giants to a Super Bowl victory in 1986. In 1990, Simms led the Giants to an 11-2 record, got injured during the next game, and the season was over. Then there's the younger Jeff Hostetler, who came in for Simms and led the Giants to Super Bowl victory in 1990. For the Ray Handley era, it's probably most remembered for the quarterback situation. For the 1991 season, it would be Jeff Hostetler who would become the quarterback. A UPI article by Dave Raffo mentioned that Handley came under fire from the media and fans by naming Hostetler the starting quarterback. Also worth mentioning, the defense. They were not too fond of whom Handley hired as the team's defense coordinator in Rod Rust in 1992. Rust was the head coach of the 1990 Patriots team that finished 1-15. But on a positive note, running back Rodney Hampton would emerge in 1991 to become a very solid and consistent 1,000-yard rusher for years to come. Hampton was the New York's first-round pick in 1990 and would take over in the backfield for Super Bowl MVP Otis Anderson, who the Giants got all they could from in 1990. Okay, so in 1991, NFL free agency has not yet begun. The roster from the 1990 Super Bowl team was still intact, but Ray Handley was taken over for a coach in Bill Parcells that, yes, could get under his players' skins and irritate them, was greatly loved by his players, and was a great motivator. Obviously, Parcells was one of the greatest coaches ever, so it was a tough situation for Handley to be in. The 1991 New York Giants, they finished 8-8, and going back to the quarterback situation, Handley's most memorable moment from the season occurred in late November, where he was confrontational with a reporter about a question regarding the quarterback situation once Hostetler would be healthy. It was an extremely fair question that actually wound up being interrupted by Handley, but for some reason the Giants head coach thought it was inappropriate to ask about the most important position and what is going on with that situation. This led to Handley walking out of this press conference. Enter the 1992 season, and Handley, he really delayed his decision on who would be the starting quarterback to begin the season. That honor would wind up going to Phil Simms, but he'd only play in 4 games due to a severe arm injury he suffered. The 1992 Giants, they finished 6-10, and Ray Handley would be fired. The Ray Handley hire did not work out. Major changes would be upcoming, and a new head coach with credibility would begin a new era in New York Giants football. Enter the 1993 NFL season, and the New York Giants hired Dan Reeves, the former Denver Broncos coach who led Denver to 3 Super Bowl appearances but had 0 Super Bowl wins. Reeves decided to have Phil Simms be his quarterback, which led to Jeff Hostetler being released and then signing with the Raiders. Other notable departures included Carl Banks, Pepper Johnson, and Leonard Marshall. So before I get to the 93 season, I want to briefly talk about New York's draft picks in the 90s. GM George Young had a better track record drafting in the 80s compared to the 90s. New York did draft several skill position players in the 90s in the first round that wound up not working out. But the Giants had a really solid defense in the 90s due to the draft. First, in 1992, the Giants, they selected a solid cornerback in the second round in Philippe Sparks, and also drafted a terrific interior defense lineman in Keith Hamilton in the 4th round. And then in 1993, in the second round, future Hall of Famer Michael Strahan was drafted, and in that same draft, New York got a steel linebacker Jesse Armstead, who was somehow drafted in the 8th round. The 1993 New York Giants had Phil Simms as a starting QB, and the Giants also had one of the better running games with Rodney Hampton at running back, and a very solid offensive line with veterans like Jumbo Elliott and Bart Oates. However, the receiving group was not a strength. The defense was young but still had Lawrence Taylor, and for the most part had their secondary still intact from the 1990 Super Bowl team with Mark Collins, Myron Guyton, and Greg Jackson. The 1993 New York Giants started with a surprising 11-3 record in a position to get a bye for the postseason, but the Giants lost their last two and finished with an 11-5 record. Dan Reeves was the coach of the year. The Giants won a playoff game against Minnesota, but then were defeated in a blowout to San Francisco. After the season, several key departures transpired that included Bart Oates, Myron Guyton, and Mark Collins. But in addition, two very notable departures would happen. One of the all-time greats, Lawrence Taylor, he would retire, the face of that Giants defense. But along with Taylor, the face of the New York Giants offense during their success the previous decade would also retire in Phil Simms. Phil Simms, he was actually released, but then subsequently, Simms decided to retire. So during this time, it was much easier, as opposed in today's game, to win games with a strong defense, strong running game, not turn the ball over, as it was easier to overcome the quarterback's weaknesses. But obviously, no matter what period, the quarterback is such an important position. After Simms retired, the Giants, they would have a hard time finding the solution at the quarterback position. For the ensuing years, the quarterbacks would be Dave Brown, Danny Cannell, and Kent Graham. First to talk about is Dave Brown, who was selected by the Giants in the first round of the supplemental draft in 1992. So Brown, he'd become the starter in 1994. It'd be his first full year as a starter at a time where first-year starting quarterbacks would struggle greatly. It really took time to develop a quarterback. Dan Reeves, he really wanted to run the ball. Brown, he'd throw about 20 to 25 times in a game in 1994. And New York, they did not hit on their first-round pick and wide receiver, Thomas Lewis, but landed a very solid cornerback in Jason Sehorn, who was drafted in the second round of the 1994 NFL Draft. The 94 Giants, they did finish with a 9-7 record, but it was a unique 9-7 record, with New York winning the first three, then losing 7 in a row, then winning their last 6 games. As for Dave Brown's first year as a starter, he was benched during a game, and he had the second highest interception percentage in the NFL that year. And I know Dave Brown's stats were not impressive, and the stats don't tell the whole story, but there was some promise. It may be hard to believe for Giants fans, but Dave Brown was seen as an up-and-coming rising quarterback, and like I said earlier, first-year QBs, they struggled and took quite some time to develop quarterbacks back then. Enter the 1995 season with Rodney Hampton's yards per carry greatly declining. New York drafted running back Tyrone Wheatley, who didn't produce as New York would have hoped, as Wheatley was much better with the Raiders. As for Dave Brown, that next step into developing a quarterback was expected. So in an interview with Rich Eisen, Brown mentioned that for his second season as a starter, the coaches wanted him to cut down on his turnovers, in which he did, but the production also went down, as the Giants finished with a 5-11 record. Entering the 96 season, this was perhaps going to be a crucial season for both head coach Dan Reeves and quarterback Dave Brown. Reeves was probably feeling that seat getting hot, going from 11-5 to 5-11 in a 3-year span. And as for Dave Brown, back then the third year is kind of when a quarterback is expected to be near his full development, and for a franchise to determine if this is the answer at quarterback or not. So back to the Rich Eisen interview, Dave Brown said the coaches wanted Brown to now throw more touchdowns, and said Brown, he only threw one more touchdown pass than in the previous year, but in addition, Brown, he threw the second most interceptions in the league and had the second highest interception percentage. The 1996 New York Giants, they finished with a 6-10 record, and as a result, Dan Reeves would be fired, and Dave Brown's time with the G-Men is close to coming to an end. Enter the 1997 NFL season, and Jim Fassel would be the new coach. Fassel was considered a quarterback guru, hoping to be the one to fix Dave Brown. The Fassel hiring is interesting to me in a couple of ways. I don't know what the fans' reaction was back then, but if this was in today's world of social media with a plentiful amount of angry opinions with hot negative takes, I'm sure most fans, not just Giants fans, but most NFL fans would go crazy ripping this hire. And that's because Fassel, he had a record of 8 games under 500 while being the head coach of the Utah Utes in the mid to late 80s. And then Fassel was also the offensive coordinator and quarterbacks coach during the Ray Handley days. And then in 1996, he was the offense coordinator for the Arizona Cardinals, where nothing statistically was close to being impressive. However, Fassel would wind up being a really solid coach for the Giants. I know there were some head-scratching decisions Fassel made, and then the blown lead in the playoffs against the 49ers, but Fassel, he was competent and knew how to do the job, as this wound up not being a bad hire at all. I understand some Giants fans might disagree with that, but Fassel, he was competent and could do the job. Supposedly, Bill Parcells was close to coming back to the Giants again. Now, to quickly sum the situation up, what happened? While the co-owners, Wellington Mara and Bob Tisch, wanted Parcells to come back, GM George Young, he opposed that idea and quickly made a call to Jim Fassel to offer him the job before anyone could contact Parcells. But anyways, in 1997 New York Giants, they had a new coach, and Dave Brown, he'd be back as a starting quarterback to begin the season. But I need to start talking about the rest of the team. First, for the 1996 NFL Draft, New York's first-round pick, 5th overall, was defensive end Cedric Jones, who didn't really make an impact. Meanwhile, their second-round pick was wide receiver Amani Toomer, who began as a kick returner for his first 3 seasons, but then Toomer became a starting wide receiver and was a really good one for the Giants, gaining 5,731 receiving yards over the next 5 years. Also worth mentioning, Big Blue's 4th-round pick was Danny Cannell. More on him later on. Then for the 1997 NFL Draft, the Giants, they had been looking desperately all through the 90s for an impact wide receiver. So for the first-round pick, 7th overall, New York drafted Ike Hilliard, who was alright, but he never gained 1,000 yards in a season, as Toomer would later become the top pass catcher for the Giants. Then for New York's second-round pick in 97, the Giants drafted running back Tiki Barber, who early on was mostly used as a third-down back while splitting carries. But Barber, he also had fumble issues. But Barber fixed his fumbling issues by basically cuffing the football high on his forearm and hard against his wrist. From 2002 to 2006, Barber, he was awesome. But then suddenly he retired, and he has an interesting case to be a Hall of Famer. Now on to the defense, and the Giants, they were able to build one of the better defenses in the NFL, at least from my point of view. And they had a really solid core with Michael Strahan and Keith Hamilton on the defensive line, Jesse Armstead at linebacker, and for some reason back then, I thought Armstead was the Giants' best defensive player in the late 90s. I think everyone else would have said Strahan, but anyways, New York, they also had a really solid cornerback tandem in Sehorn and Sparks. So for the 1997 NFL season, Dave Brown was a starting quarterback. The Giants, they began 2-3. And for that 6th game, Brown, he had a rough start, was injured, and in to take the snaps was the aforementioned Danny Cannell. Cannell played much better than Brown as New York defeated Dallas, and the Giants had won their next 3 to go 6-3. Head coach Jim Fassel quickly shut down the question about a quarterback controversy, saying that Cannell will start the rest of the season, as Fassel acknowledged that the team played better with Cannell as a quarterback. So Cannell's play, it wasn't impressive, but nonetheless, the 97 New York Giants, they finished the season with a surprising 10-5-1 record, winning the NFC East. Fassel was the coach of the year, but in a home playoff game in the wild card round, the Giants lost at home to the Minnesota Vikings. A pretty good first year for Jim Fassel and the New York Giants. So the 1997 New York Giants, they surprised many, going 10-5-1 with Danny Cannell quarterback, and winning with their strength being their defense. During this time, the NFC East was not a strong division. Perhaps the Giants made the playoffs by taking advantage of a weak schedule in 1997. Enter the 98 NFL season, the Giants, they cut Dave Brown, who then signed with Arizona. Danny Cannell, who didn't do anything spectacular in 1997, as Dave Brown was the one who had the higher ceiling, but it was Cannell who led the Giants to the playoffs as he'd be the starter in 1998. As for the Giants front office, longtime GM George Young would leave the Giants to take a position in the NFL office. Ernie Accorsi would be the new GM, more on Accorsi later on. So the 1998 New York Giants would start with a 3-7 record. Danny Cannell wasn't able to win like he did in 1997 and would be benched. Kent Graham would be the new signal caller, and the Giants finished 5-1 with Graham at quarterback. The most memorable win was when the Giants defeated a 13-0 Denver Broncos team, where Kent Graham connected with Amani Toomer for the game-winning touchdown with under a minute left. So who exactly are the New York Giants around this time? Are they as good as the 10-5-1 team from 1997? Are they the team that started 3-7 or the team that finished 5-1 in 1998? Ernie Accorsi, he liked to build his teams, starting with the quarterback and then in the trenches. So the defensive line was a strength and the offensive line was pretty good. The quarterback position had to be fixed. Danny Cannell was released by the Giants, then he only made 4 more starts in the NFL. Enter the 1999 season, Ernie Accorsi, he made a surprising move in signing quarterback Kerry Collins to a 4-year, $16.9 million contract, which was big money back then. Collins, to briefly put it, had a rough ending during his time with the Carolina Panthers and then had a rough lone year with the New Orleans Saints. So this was a very surprising signing. But what wound up happening is that Collins had his most success during his 17-year NFL career with the Giants. So in 1999, Kent Graham began as a starter. The offense was sputtering, then Kerry Collins replaced Kent Graham, who then wound up starting 67 consecutive games thereafter. Hence, the Giants, they found a pretty solid solution in Kerry Collins to play quarterback. So the 1999 New York Giants had finished with a 7-9 record, but for the 2000 NFL season, they were not expected to be Super Bowl contenders. But in reality, when you look back at the roster, they were pretty well balanced, but the big part was that they're able to get their offense to finally being competent. 2000 was a memorable season for the New York Giants fans that include Jim Fassel making a poker reference, saying he's shoving his chips in the middle of the table and raising the ante that his Giants are going to the playoffs. As a result, New York had the best record in the NFC and played a phenomenal game against Minnesota in the NFC Championship game, winning 41-0, but then ran into a buzzsaw against what may be considered the greatest defense ever in 2000 Baltimore Ravens, as New York wasn't able to collect the third Super Bowl victory. New York still had talent, was only able to make the playoffs one more time during the Jim Fassel era, which was in 2002, where the Giants had a 38-14 lead but lost 39-38 against the San Francisco 49ers. Fassel's last season was in 2003, and in would be Tom Coughlin, and Eli Manning would then be drafted, and Ernie Accorsi did a great job building a really strong defensive line, and as they say, the rest is history. Thank you so much for your interest in this video. I greatly appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And tell me what you think about the Giants in the 90s down below. Thank you so much, and thank you for all the support.